Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And here we are on the final legislative day of Inauguration Week. As a Democrat, this was a week of mixed feelings for me and for my colleagues on this side of the aisle, but I am also a genetic optimist. So on Monday, I went to the inauguration, yes, concerned, but also optimistic about new possibilities. Committed, as I always have been, to finding ways to work with my Republican colleagues for the benefit of my constituents and celebrating the peaceful transfer of power. This time. Because, Mr. Speaker, as we all know, 4 years and 17 days ago today, in this chamber, a brutal, violent, criminal attempt was made to prevent the peaceful transfer of power in our democracy. Thousands of people rioted and descended on the Capitol, and they broke windows, and they attacked police officers with heavy objects, with bear spray, with their fists, with anything at hand. Several carried firearms. 140 police officers were assaulted. Let me say that again. 140 police officers were assaulted that day. All of us have memories of that day. I started the day up in that corner of the gallery, and when it became clear that we had to evacuate, because I was in the gallery with some colleagues, it took a long time. So we saw what was happening on the floor. We saw the Capitol Police with weapons drawn as an object broke the window of the main door to the House. We watched the Capitol Police move a heavy article of furniture. In this country, it was an article of furniture that prevented the rioters from getting into this chamber. We've all seen the images. This time, we had a peaceful transfer of power. Now, on Inauguration Day, I kept that optimism until the moment that the new president took the decision to pardon not those who were wrongly convicted for their actions on that day, not those who just got caught up in the frenzy, didn't know maybe that they were committing an offense by trespassing on the Capitol grounds. The new president pardoned every single person, including those involved in those assaults on 140 police officers, every single one of them. That was an uncomfortable moment for some of my colleagues, particularly on the Republican side. They were asked, and well, they hadn't read the pardons and they hadn't heard the story, and it was an uncomfortable moment. The Speaker responded by saying, yeah, we're not looking backwards, we're looking forwards. And then very shortly thereafter reconstituted a committee to investigate the people who investigated what happened here on January 6th. The Speaker of the House said, House Republicans are proud of our work so far in exposing the false narratives peddled by the politically motivated January 6th Select Committee during the 117th Congress. The false narratives. I get it. Sometimes people on my side of the aisle do things with which I do not agree. And I try to have the principle and the integrity to call them out for it. You have two choices when people on your side do things that are wrong. You can call them out, you can stand with principle, and you can be clear. That's what leaders do. Or you can obfuscate and try to change history. Try to suggest that what we all saw and experienced traumatically wasn't what we all saw and experienced. You can make stuff up, like maybe the FBI instigated it. Maybe it was really Nancy Pelosi's responsibility. Maybe it was Antifa. Oh gosh, maybe the people who assaulted 140 police officers were just like tourists. That is not the way of leadership. That is some dark, and evil way of proceeding. Why? Because it dishonors the truth on which the stability of this republic relies. And maybe just as importantly, it dishonors all of us who were there that day and who saw with our own eyes what happened. And maybe worst of all, it dishonors the brave men and women who put their lives on the line that day to protect us. Those of us who put up the signs on our office doors saying, "Thank you, Capitol Police," only to turn around and remain silent when the attackers of the Capitol Police were pardoned on Monday. These are people who put their lives on the line to protect us and the democracy. I think it's worth spending a minute or two, Mr. Speaker, to remind us who these people were and what happened. Brian Sitnick, Capitol Police officer. He stood outside the gates here and fended off the attackers as they bear sprayed him in the face and eyes. The very next day, Officer Sitnick suffered 2 strokes and ultimately died, making him the first fatality of January 6th. Officer Brian Sitnick was only the 4th Capitol Police officer to die in the line of duty. Julian Cater pled guilty to pepper spraying Brian Sitnick, and he was pardoned on Monday. Officer Jeffrey Smith of the Metropolitan Police Department. He fought off rioters in the Capitol that day, only to be struck in the face by a metal pole as the siege continued that night. You can imagine the trauma. We feel it. We didn't get struck in the face by a metal pole, though. Days later, Officer Smith climbed into his Ford Mustang and shot himself in the head. Those who assaulted Officer Jeffrey Smith, now pardoned. Officer Howie Liebengood grew up in the Senate. He followed his father around. His father at the time was the Senate Sergeant at Arms. On January 6th, Officer Liebengood was posted to Senate security, where he faced down the rioters. He came back to work despite what he had seen on January 6th, on the 7th and the 8th and the 9th, unwilling to quit and inconvenience his fellow similarly depleted and exhausted officers. On the night of the 9th, Howie Liebengood took out his service revolver and shot himself. Officer Gunter Hashida, decorated Metropolitan Police Department officer. He earned the Medal of Valor, the Life-Saving Medal, and a variety of other medals throughout his 18-year career. He served on the department's emergency response team and responded here on January 6th. Officer Hashida took his own life at home in July of 2021. Officer Kyle DeFreytag, 26 years old. He'd been on the job for 5 years when he deployed to the riot, to the insurrection. He was tasked with enforcing the curfew put in place that evening. 26 years old when he committed suicide. The trauma suffered by these officers was not an accident. It wasn't an act of God or an act of nature. It was done to them by people, each and every one of whom has now been pardoned. And not just pardoned, but they're out there now celebrating and thinking about what's next. So, I guess I have 3 questions for my colleagues before I invite them to reflect on what this week has meant to them. The first question I have is, we put up the signs on the doors, "Thank you, brave police officers." Do we honor the heroic work of those who protected us? Or do we denigrate it by suggesting that it just wasn't that big a deal? Is this just about signs on office doors? Or do we raise our voices and say those who attacked the people who protected us don't deserve a pardon and certainly don't deserve celebration? Question number 2. Are we, and when I say we, each and every one of us and each and every American, are we committed without reservation or condition to the idea that our differences are worked out in here with words and debate, not out there with bear spray and clubs? Are we committed to that idea? Or do we celebrate and pardon and elevate those who wield bear spray and clubs? I hear all too often something that is pernicious in moral thinking and corrosive of our political dialogue. The whataboutism. Yeah, that was bad on January 6th, but what about Black Lives Matter throwing bricks through Starbucks windows in Seattle? What about the Biden pardons? Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, I'm not a fan of the Biden pardons either. And I'm not afraid to say so. That thing about principle. But the whataboutism that equates a violent attempt to change the peaceful transfer of power with some idiot who throws a brick through a Starbucks window in Seattle or Portland, that is a lack of discernment. And more to the point, what a moral failure. We don't let 3-year-olds defend themselves with the idea that somebody else did it too. How has this become an exculpatory thing in our politics? Third and last, Mr. Speaker, and this is something that I think each and every one of us should reflect on. Where is your line? At what point do you say no? At what point do you find the courage to say, no, Mr. President, that's not right? This week we learned that for most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, the pardon of the attackers of these police officers was not outside that line. At what point do you say no? At what point do you remember that the Congress is here to be a check and a balance on the president, regardless of the president's party? Mr. Speaker, if you can't answer that question, if you don't have that point, and if you don't have the commitment to principle and the courage to stand by that point, well, Mr. Speaker, I fear for the future of our republic. With that, I would like to yield to a number of my colleagues, beginning with the gentleman, Mr. Landsman.
Thank you, Congressman, for doing this and including us. I appreciate your leadership. Mr. Speaker, I was legitimately shocked. And I'm certain that this was the first time ever the President of the United States, certainly in my lifetime, released hundreds of violent criminals from jails and sent them into our communities. People who've now said that they're determined to buy weapons, pursue more violence. These are convicted criminals. They conspired to overthrow their own government. They stormed this Capitol. They destroyed property, sacred property. They attacked police officers. And on day one, a day that was supposed to be about fixing the economy, lowering prices, actual border security, and real immigration reform, the focus was on releasing these violent criminals. It's a betrayal to the American people, to law enforcement, and it's made us all less safe. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Landsman. With that, I would like to recognize my good friend, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Congressman Himes, thank you so much for convening this special order. Thank you for your eloquence and your passion. Mr. Speaker, I represent many of those people who protect us on Capitol Hill. Members of the Capitol Police, of the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Police Force, the Arlington County Police, police who live in my Northern Virginia district. January 6th was not some distant, abstract event for my constituents. Democracy was on the line that day, but so were their lives, their bodies, their physical safety and well-being. And as events spiraled out of control on January 6th, calls for help went out on the police radios, and they were answered by men and women in uniform throughout the metropolitan Washington, Virginia, Maryland area. Some of whom were off duty. Many were off duty, and they chose to get dressed, jump in the cars, and race in to help us, to protect our Capitol, to protect all here who work here. Hundreds of those officers still bear the wounds, seen and unseen, that will never heal. The January 6 pardons and commutations were some of the worst things that Donald Trump has ever done. With these pardons, Trump embraced lawlessness and violence. Trump pardoned people who beat and tased my constituent, Officer Michael Fanone, tased repeatedly in the neck. And he described it as being like torture, and it led to him having a heart attack at that very time. Jeff pardoned the people who gave a brain injury to my officer constituent, Jeffrey Smith, days before he died by suicide. Congressman Himes mentioned how he was beaten in the head with a pole. His wife, Erin Smith, said those injuries changed him in his final days. He was a different person. And as Officer Smith's death was later ruled as a line of duty death because it resulted from the injuries suffered here on our behalf. Trump pardoned the people who attacked my constituent, Officer Brian Sicknick. They sprayed him with pepper spray hours before his death from 2 strokes. The medical examiner said his death was from natural causes, but what happened to Brian before his death during the attack on the Capitol clearly led to his death. Trump pardoned people who charted Nazi slogans, who yelled racial slurs at our black police officers, including, and those who called for the assassination here of Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Trump's own Vice President, Mike Pence. Trump pardoned a man who was charged with throwing an explosive device at the police in the Capitol. This was a man who previously been convicted of domestic violence, battery by strangulation. Trump pardoned a man who stomped on an officer's head, who beat other officers with a flagpole and a crutch and with pieces of furniture, and sprayed officers with pepper spray. Trump pardoned a man who ripped off the gas mask of a police officer, beat him in the face with that, and then crushed him in a door. Trump pardoned hundreds of people who pleaded guilty to assaulting law enforcement, many of them with deadly weapons. He pardoned or commuted the sentences of over a dozen violent criminals convicted of seditious conspiracy. And by pardoning those who carry out these heinous crimes, Trump has made our country less safe, and he betrayed law enforcement heroes who protected the Capitol at great personal cost. These pardons send a message that violent crime, even against law enforcement, will be sanctioned by Trump's government if it is carried out in his name. I urge my colleagues to remember the families of the 5 police officers who died as a result of January 6th. Officer Brian Sicknick, Jeffrey Smith, Howie Liebengood, Gunther Hashida, and Kyle DeFreitag. And I urge you to remember the many officers who defended the Capitol on January 6th, who put themselves at risk to protect us, and who will carry the scars, and seen and unseen, as long as they will live. These scars are inflicted by people who will face no further legal consequences for those acts, thanks to President Donald Trump. This injustice is a gross betrayal of their service and sacrifice, but does not diminish their patriotism. After January 6th, many of my colleagues posted messages of support for law enforcement and the Capitol Police. It was on their doors, it was on their walls in the halls of Longworth and Rayburn and Cannon. It was even on social media. Members like Speaker Johnson, who called for the prosecution of those criminals who committed those acts of violence against the police who guard the Capitol. Let me quote Speaker Johnson, to the fullest extent of the law. Republicans went on to hold votes on symbolic, non-binding resolutions expressing support for police. Back to the blue, they told us. Back to blue. Their silence, or worse, their defense of Trump's pardons are unforgivable. They can never again claim to back the blue with any credibility. Finally, a warning. With these pardons, Trump put violent, dangerous people back into our communities. Many of them did terrible things on other days besides January 6th, 2021. But all of them have just been emboldened by receiving get-out-of-jail-free cards from this president. Who knows what other criminal acts they will perpetrate next? Unfortunately, we're all about to find out. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. I would like to yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
I want to thank my colleague for organizing this special order, appropriately so, because this is the conclusion of the inauguration efforts of this week. On January 6, 2021, I have expressed numerous times to my constituents and to my colleagues that it was the saddest day of the 20 years that I've had the privilege and honor to serve in the Congress. That day, the world watched as a violent mob of insurrectionists breached the Capitol, attacked the police viciously, and tried to overturn a fair and free election. I was one of 25 members trapped in the House gallery for 40 minutes as we were observing the counting of the ballots as a part of our responsibility every 4 years. Let me tell you something. This was not a peaceful protest, as some have tried to portray it, including President Trump and Speaker Johnson. Let me repeat this. The photos and the videos that we've all seen over the last 4 years make it very clear. This was no love fest. It was not a peaceful protest. It was a violent insurrection attempt to overthrow a fair and free election. I feel very strongly about this, having been trapped up in that gallery with my colleagues here for 40 minutes. On that day, I came to the House chambers with my colleagues to certify the 2020 presidential election, which President Joe Biden had won overwhelmingly. 4 years later, this week, my colleagues and I are speaking out to ensure that no one rewrites history with a false narrative, which we see being attempted to take place. Just a handful of brave officers up at that gallery that day, brave Capitol Police officers, stood between us and the violent mob that had already breached the Senate chamber and now were trying to force their way in here to the People's House. I took this photograph when I was crouched down there with my gas mask because of the attempt of this violent insurrectionist group of people. I remember crouching on the floor with my colleagues thinking, how could this be happening? I thought it was surreal, unbelievable, that it would happen in the United States of America, the oldest democracy in the world. As a student of American history, I thought to myself, as strong and as resilient as our democracy, our country has been historically during wars and depressions, it was a stark reminder to me while we were up there wondering what our fate might be, how fragile our democracy can be. This week, President Trump pardoned over 1,500 perpetrators convicted for assaulting police officers and was noted by some of my colleagues here this afternoon, some who lost their lives. These are some of the folks, these Proud Boys that were trying to break into the chambers here. The police had them on the ground. They had their hands bound. We finally got out of these chambers and walked out as we were being escorted to a safe place. And we saw people trying to break in to get us, to get the speaker, to hang the vice president at the direction of President Trump, trying to overthrow the results of the 2020 elections. I do not believe these pardons that took place here this week were justified, and I think the majority of Americans don't believe they were either. We cannot allow history to be rewritten. Facts are the facts. The documentation, the hearings, and the videos are proof of what happened that day. 4 years ago, those violent insurrectionists chose a different path as President Trump's direction. They shattered the sacred traditional peaceful transfer of power, which has been the cornerstone of our democracy dating back to our first president, George Washington. Now let's talk about this week. While I didn't agree with the outcome of last year's election, I respected it. That's the essence of a democracy. This Monday, on the inauguration, we had a peaceful transfer of power led by President Biden and the other former presidents. That's the way it's supposed to be. But it wasn't that way 4 years ago. No, it wasn't that way 4 years ago. Let me just say something. And I wish more of my Republican colleagues had the profiles and courage that I think that's required. We Democrats are not election deniers. We may not have liked the results of last year's election, but we accepted them. So we cannot allow history to be rewritten, nor can we forget the sacrifices of the brave Capitol Police who risked everything to protect our democracy. They stood on the front lines, giving their all to defend the ideals that we hold dear, and they should be appropriately honored with more than simply a sign on our door. And their families. We owe it to them and to our constituents to ensure that the truth remains clear, that justice is served, and that we never let those who sought to tear us apart rewrite the story on January 6, 2021. Let me close by just telling you the simple, plain truth. My mother, as a young boy, told me, Jim, the truth is the truth. America is a great country. Some of us like to say the greatest country in the world because we honor the truth. That's why we are here today. That's why this special order is important. That's why I want to thank my colleagues for speaking out, because America is a great country because we honor and respect the truth. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California and yield time to Mr. Jackson of Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today because in light of the President's January 6 pardons, someone has to stand up for the people who defend this building, who defend the representatives of the United States of America, who defend this magnificent institution. I'd like to thank my esteemed colleague, Congressman Hines, for reserving this special order hour, because it's time that truth speaks. Just the other day, at the beginning of this week, the members of the Capitol and Metropolitan Police protected us once again as we engaged in the inauguration ceremonies of the 47th President of the United States of America. And the irony is that while they were protecting us, the Chief Executive Officer of the federal government was preparing to undermine the spirit and the substance of that protection. The very idea of pardoning people who violently attacked police officers who were protecting the United States Capitol is an anathema and should be offensive to every member of this body. I simply cannot think of a more disgraceful act than to disrespect the life and blood and legacy of the men and women of the Capitol Police and Metropolitan Police Force, who in some cases literally gave their lives to protect this institution and us as representatives. To pardon people who relished and participated in acts of political violence that led to the death of innocent people is something that cannot be and should not be overlooked. It cannot be explained away, nor can it be facilitated by politics and regular parliamentary procedure. What the 47th President of the United States has done in pardoning the people who attacked the police officers is simply wrong. I echo the words of my dear colleague, Congressman Costa. We've been taught right versus wrong. Every member of my esteemed party members on the opposite aisle should join us in raising their voice. We are setting a precedent. We should know and we should call out when character counts. It is offensive to say that nothing of the fact that it is a violation of the moral law that makes this country one of the finest flowers in the gardens of nation. But I rise today to tell the members of law enforcement who protect this building, who protect our lives, that the members of the Democratic Party see you. We understand and we respect you. We respect your character, and we are ashamed at the behavior of this institution. We are ashamed at the behavior of the 47th President of the United States of America. We are ashamed that you have been disgraced and humiliated while you come here to protect us every day. We have not afforded you the same protection that you give us every day. We honor you, we respect you with giving you this hour to tell you that we have not forgotten those that have given their full measure of their duty to this country to protect us and to ensure that this democracy goes forward, even as you have been betrayed. And we do not support the unsolicited and unwarranted disrespect extended to you by the President of the United States of America. There were quotes given by Reverend Martin Luther King the other day. There's one quote I'd like to share that says, expedience asks the question, is it politics? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? The conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time that we must take a position that is neither safe nor popular, that is neither with politics or does it have to be popular. We must have to ask the question the conscience raises, is it right? At some point, you have to stop functioning in this building as if its political parties are the only thing that matters. At some point, we have to summon the courage to do what is right, even when it is not necessarily politically expedient. This is one of those times. What happened on January 6th was violence. What happened on January 6th was a disgrace to the men and women that serve this institution honorably. And anybody who tries to make it out to be anything other than that, than actually what it was, is lying about what we saw with our very own eyes. We shall know the truth, and the truth shall set us all free. How can we go forward if we cannot go forward in the truth? No lie can live forever. The election of 2020 had been decided. The people that came here on January 6th, that was not a day that most people in American history know what goes on procedurally that happens here. What happens there was supposed to be the transfer of power with the electoral college votes that we ceremoniously passed. No, people were summoned. People were called. Who called them? What were they called to do? They came here. They built a noose and a galley outside to hang the Vice President of the United States of America. And we sit here in silence. We act like it never happened. What concerns me most now is that we're sowing the seeds for future anarchists. We're sowing the seeds for future insurrectionists. We're sowing the seeds for future levels of violence. I would remind my colleagues that history is watching. The future is listening. And our children are observing everything that we do. Mr. Roy, and before we get up and speak reckless about a mob that violently attacked police officers, we would all be wise to consider how our words will age in years to come and whether future generations will condemn what we said or remain silent about this issue. Mr. Speaker, the reality is no lie can, will, or shall live forever. Whether today or tomorrow, or whether in days or decades to come, truth will have its day, and we shall know the truth, and the truth shall set us free. So let us work to do what is right, even when it is hard. Let us affirm what is good, even when it is politically dangerous. Just yesterday, in this same chamber, where the officers were defending us, members of January 6th insurrectionists came in here and sat up in the gallery's chambers. Just this past week, there were 32 miles of fencing all around our beautiful capital. If we had known then what we knew now, police should have had the day off so these people could have roamed this building freely. That was their intent, was to destroy and kill. The constitutional ideals that make this nation as good as its promise are what each of us should be in service to do. And when history calls, we must be available to something greater than ourselves. I pray that we will answer this call. I pray we will not dishonor what is right. I pray we will stand up for those who consistently stand up for us. I take a point of privilege, and I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to those officers who came to work on that dreadful day to do what was right and normal and moral, who had been betrayed. Reverend Martin Luther King also said, there comes a time where silence is betrayal. And I feel as if many of our officers have been betrayed. But we can fix this. We can stand up. We can speak out. We cannot betray the legacy of those officers that had been slain, violently killed. They did not give their life. Their life was taken from them. They should be with their loved ones today. Let us not curse their memory by not erecting a statue and a monument to their brave souls. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say a very special thank you to my colleague, Congressman Hines, for having the courage, the fortitude to stand up and let the record reflect in years to come. We did our best to make sure we honored our commitment to this country. Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois, and I believe I'm welcoming our last speaker, my fellow New Englander, the gentle lady from Vermont, Ms. Balin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Himes. Day one, our president made our country less safe. Day one. With an irresponsible stroke of his pen, Donald Trump released 500 violent felons back out onto our streets. These are the criminals who brutally attacked cops who were protecting this building. These were the people who betrayed our country, our democracy. I'm not talking about the people who merely showed up that day to protest, who didn't commit crimes. This is about the attackers who beat cops with pipes and flagpoles and tasers and mace, who literally stomped on police and tried to poke their eyes out. These were the sweeping pardons that Donald Trump made on day one. And these pardons disproportionately benefited the most violent among the mob. And now they're back out on the street, heading to our communities. A number of them have already publicly commented they're going to go buy some more guns, they're out for retribution, and they have no remorse for what they did. And of course, Americans are angry by this, and rightly so. Of course they are. It's an awful thing that the president has done, and it puts Americans in danger. Among those who are angry is the Fraternal Order of Police, the largest police union in the U.S., and the International Association of Police Chiefs. They understand more than anyone that this puts law enforcement at risk. In a statement, they said, quote, "When perpetrators of crimes, especially serious crimes, are not held fully accountable, it sends a dangerous message that the consequences for attacking law enforcement are not severe. And they further worried that it could encourage more violence against law enforcement. If you can viciously attack a police officer and get off scot-free, what kind of message is that? So violence is acceptable if it's committed on Donald Trump's behalf? It's okay to beat a cop if it's in the service of keeping him in power? This is incredibly dangerous. And I gotta say, it looks an awful lot like the actions of someone who would like to be a dictator. How can the officers who protect us believe that we actually value them if the president doesn't believe in holding people accountable who attack them? How? Over the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to get to know many of the officers on the Capitol Police Force. They take their jobs incredibly seriously. They have our backs every day. They put their lives on the line, not just to protect our flesh and blood, but to protect the very democracy, to protect the ideals of this country. And these pardons, like many of those who spoke before me have said, it's important to make this connection. These pardons are part of a concerted effort to rewrite what happened on January 6th. This desecrates the memory of Officer Brian Sicknick, who lost his life in defense of this building, and it diminishes the great sacrifices that were made by thousands of officers that day. If we don't push back on this perverted rewriting of history, we can look forward to our children and our grandchildren learning about the glories of January 6th, 2021. But it has to be remembered for what it was. It was a domestic terrorist attack, plain and simple. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to be trapped in a lie that they can't get out of. Because I know by the eye rolls, and actually even before we went into the inauguration, I saw some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle doing impressions of the incoming president, making fun of him. But they are now trapped in this lie that they have perpetuated for years now, and they don't know how to get out of it. What Donald Trump has done on day one is to say to the Capitol Police, I value violent felons more than I value you. And I know I speak for so many Americans today, that makes me sick. I yield back.
I thank my colleague from Vermont, and as we close this up, as is so often and true in this chamber, lots of words, and I think they were powerful words, honoring those who protected us, honoring the truth. But what can we do? What's the action? What can we actually do? Under the law, passed a few years ago, Congress was required to produce a plaque to honor those officers who sacrificed so much on that fateful day 4 years and 17 days ago. The plaque reads, and I've got a little photograph of it here, the plaque reads, on behalf of a grateful Congress, this plaque honors the extraordinary individuals who bravely protected and defended this symbol of democracy on January 6, 2021. Their heroism will never be forgotten. You can only look at the photo of the plaque because the plaque has never been put up as required by law on the Capitol of the United States. It's a little curious. We say it, their heroism will never be forgotten. And yet the plaque, as required by law, is not yet displayed in the Capitol of the United States. I thank the Speaker for presiding over this special order and request unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material into the record, and yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection.